Dr. Takashima Claremon, thank you very much for joining the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Oh, your article on sustainability kind of caught my eye because the conclusion of it, or maybe something that I took away, was that overthinking, actually analytical thinking, is one of the enemies of sustainability. So I thought to have you on the podcast and explore this idea a little bit more.
Yes.
I know that you write in the book right now, right? But maybe before we start, if you could say a few words about your background.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Tokyo, Japan. I grew up there until high school, but I have an unusual kind of experience because I never went to Japanese school. So I always had this cross cultural experience growing up, just with people who speak different languages, who look different, and have different customs and values. And so that's always been really fascinating to me. And then, so for college, I came to the US. I went to Cornell and studied psychology and went back to Japan, worked there for 5 years doing marketing. And then after that, I came back to the US and went to business school. And, I was just doing my MBA, but I decided my second year that I really enjoyed uh, more of the empirical and trying to understand things on a deeper level than just what's the bottom line, how do we apply it to business, and a story. So that's why I decided to do a PhD. And I focused on cross cultural differences and how people behave and make choices, particularly in the consumption context between Asia and the West.
How did your PhD thesis relate to this subject?
It's a good question. So, when I did my dissertation, I wasn't thinking about sustainability. It's really recently that I started to really get interested in sustainability and learn more. And so recently I got my certificate in sustainability from UCLA. And I'm also now teaching a class right now, actually, on social sustainability. So it's about how do you engage stakeholders, how do you engage communities so that their voices are heard. So a lot of it is about behavioral change and trying to engage with people who may not necessarily agree with you and trying to look at sustainability from a more comprehensive perspective, because oftentimes when people think about sustainability, they only think about the environment. And, aspects like this is kind of going into my book in my thesis, but thinking about polar bears and rainforests and plastic pollution versus thinking about vulnerable communities and, the pollution and the racism that they face every day.
I'm assuming that the idea is people can't project this issue affecting them, right? Maybe that's why they don't really take it seriously enough.
So I think one of the key reasons why people don't understand social sustainability is because it's not as measurable or tangible as environmental impact. So, when you think about the environment, you can think about carbon footprint and different kinds of emissions. When you're thinking about people and poverty and racism, it's really hard to track and measure. And so I think that's a key part of it. But an interesting point is, this is going to get a little bit touchy, but even in the sustainability world, oftentimes the demographic who is attracted to this topic are not the people who live in vulnerable communities. So they're usually white and more middle to upper class. So they tend to not really understand the issues that these vulnerable communities face on a day-to-day basis.
Trying to go back to the idea that um, this reliance on analytical thinking become the problem in sustainability. I'm just trying to connect. How does that? What causes it?
First of all, let's define what analytic thinking is a little bit more. So, analytic thinking is when you are rational and linear in your thinking, and you tend to look for more black or white solutions. So, it's a really good way to solve issues in maybe the hard sciences or math when you're looking for a single solution and there's no context and you can separate it from any kind of situational factors. this becomes more of an issue when it's not black or white and things are more interconnected and there are various things that influence certain outcomes. So, if you think there's a single cause and effect relationship for everything, that kind of myopic, narrow thinking can lead to, different kinds of negative externalities, unintended consequences that you may have been able to predict if you had used a more holistic approach. So the contrast here that I'm making is analytic versus holistic. And so the holistic approach is more about nonlinear thinking. And the other thing about analytic thinking that I should mention is that the tendency is to look at things as more distinct and autonomous and separate from everything else. And this goes for when you're looking at objects or individuals or events. So it is more prevalent in the West and in, especially in the US, where there is a very extreme view of independence and individualistic preferences. So the holistic approach is more of a non-Western way of thinking about the world. And it's more about non-linear thinking. And you tend to look at the world as less predictable and things are transient and are constantly changing. So that makes them look at the situation in a more holistic way and understand that things are more interrelated.
And is there like a history behind it? Why is it West chosen, or maybe why are Western people are more of the focused? I don't know, individualistic versus the East that are more like community based.
Yeah, so it goes back to ancient Greek culture. And so the ancient Greek culture was really unique during those times because out of necessity, most societies were interdependent and, they viewed themselves as interconnected and interrelational. However, in ancient Greece, they had this individual view of the self. So people were more independent. Debate was a very important aspect of being a man. He was considered to be as important as being a good warrior. So why is that individualistic? It's because it's about self-expression and being able to express your own opinions and inner values was considered to be very important. And so that led to this more analytic type of thinking. And in contrast, in ancient China, people had this more holistic view. And so these are the two different origins of this type of thinking.
So I'm assuming that people who listen to this, they'll be like, oh, duh. But then you look at the ancient Greece that was democratic, and you look at the United States that's considered to be a democracy. But then you look at the Asian world and China, which is hard to call democratic. Maybe this analytic thinking is equal to kind of related to democracy. Is the argument for that or against that?
So it's a good question. So I think it's important to understand that democracy is not about individualism. It's about individual rights. So you can have individual rights even when in a collectivistic culture. So take Japan or South Korea. It's more collectivistic. They're democracies. They're thriving economies. So individualism is more a focus on the self, but it's not necessarily tied directly to individual rights.
What about a connection between this individualism and capitalism?
I think there is definitely a connection there between the current form of extreme capitalism that you see in the US. I don't know if you're familiar with Robert Putnam and his article that was published, I think, in 1995. But he writes about the demise of social capital in the US and how civic engagement since the 1950s has declined. So you can argue that the US used to be more communal and collectivistic and interdependent. But with the neoliberal capitalism and economics, this became more and more of a cutthroat, independent type of society.
I guess the question would be, are we looking for the solution? Like you have a country in the United States, right, where half of the people are concerned about it, and the second half is not really. Like you have a half that's get really concerned about environment. You have the same half that's concerned about the social issues, and almost leaning towards socialism. And there is the other half. They just say like, "Hey guys, the country is perfect as is." How do we find solution here?
So I think this is also another really interesting topic, and I'm starting to really do some more research on this. And what I'm finding, so, again, like my lens is always cross-cultural. And so I've been doing some more research about sustainability in Japan. And what I'm finding is in the Edo period, which is in the early 1600s to mid 1800s, Edo, so Japan was had an isolationist foreign policy during that time. So it basically had closed borders. So it had to be self-sufficient. And Edo during that time had over 1 million people and was the biggest city in the world, but also the cleanest and the greenest. So they actually made it work somehow. And why I'm mentioning this is because I think the more I study what liberal values are and conservative values are, I'm seeing a lot of similarities between conservative values and Japanese values. And so, again, Japan is an outlier in many ways. It's an island, it's more homogenous. So you can argue that things are easier to do there. Also culturally, different. People tend to follow the rules and things like that. But I think liberals are actually not doing a very good job of communicating their concerns with the conservatives. And so it's not that conservatives don't care, because so there's a Yale research study where they reframed the way they talked about environmental issues. So they talked about protecting the environment as protecting God's dominion and about sanctity, versus how liberals talk about it is about fairness and care about the vulnerable communities, which conservatives don't care about, right? So you have to use a language that resonates with the other party if your ultimate objective is to change their minds and get them to work with you. And so I think the issue is, again, this analytic thinking where you're like, well, this is what I think, this is how I'm going to communicate. I don't need to change the way I am or the way I think or the language I use because I think I'm right. So there's this like moralistic way of talking to people that just doesn't resonate. And so, we need to change the way that we communicate with people who may not necessarily on the surface agree with us.
And by we mean, you mean who exactly? The government, individuals, or what's the solution? Who's going to be kind of looking for this bridge between people?
So I want to mention that I think there's a little too much onus currently, even among the liberals and sustainability advocates, that it's about individual actions. Like we should eat less meat, we should save water, we should shop locally. Yes, those things are great, but it's just not enough to move the needle. And so that's the danger of being more individualistic, is thinking that each person has accountability. But if you think about it, the individuals are not the people who created this issue, right, of environmental racism or pollution or what have you. These are institutions that created certain kinds of policies or certain types of products. And so we need to hold these institutions, so companies, corporate America, and policymakers accountable and make sure that they work together to move the needle.
And again, by we it means, so because today we have only let's just call it a liberal part of the country focused on sustainability, we basically, they need to find a way to communicate it to the right and push the government and other institutions to do that. Is it fair?
Right. So, I mean, now we have a new administration that cares more about sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, the Biden administration created a new position called the climate advisory, national climate advisor, I think is what the position is called. And it's filled by a woman called Gina McCarthy. And she talks about, the reason why we need to protect the environment is to protect people and their health. And so she's talking about, again, like a broader definition of sustainability. And so she's trying to talk the language that will hopefully engage a wider audience versus just talking to inside an echo chamber. And I think part of the solution has to be education. So K through 12, I think this year in New Jersey, starting the fall, they are mandated to include climate change in their curriculum. So these types of changes are slowly starting to happen. And if we can incorporate, climate change, sustainability, these issues in math class, in civics class, in US history class, then we can really start to create this mosaic of like, okay, I see why I need to care about this, right? And then, I mean, this should not be a liberal or conservative issue. This is about our future, our children's future, and we should all care. So again, it's how we talk about it, because there's also data that shows that societies that are have extreme inequality, everybody suffers. Even the top 1% suffers. So that's a fact, right? And this is not just about like kumbaya. We should be nice to each other. This has clear economic implications, right? If so many people are living in vulnerable communities and are breathing polluted air and eating highly processed foods that are not nutritious, it affects their brain development, it affects their productivity, right? So that's what conservatives care about. So let's talk about that. Let's not talk about, we should be nice to minorities, or, we should be doing that. That should be type of language is again moralistic and is ineffective.
Are there like examples of countries that tend to utilize this holistic approach versus one or the other?
So I want to make sure that I'm making it clear that holistic versus analytic, it's not a clear, like, this country is completely holistic or this country is completely analytic. It's always a spectrum. So my point is that we need to be incorporating both and using a more integrative approach, because we need both, right? We need analytic thinking when we're trying to solve certain types of solutions or types of issues. But we need to sometimes take a step back to make sure we're not missing anything and that things haven't changed since we started looking at the problem. So Japan has really interesting solutions. So, according to like the UN's SDGs ranking, Japan is actually not doing so well in terms of sustainability. But that's, again, another Western kind of thinking. It's this framework and metrics. Japan's sustainability is more about culture, and it's a lifestyle and a mindset. So, in Japan, there's this native religion called Shintoism, which is more like, it's similar to Native American philosophies, where you're one with nature, everything has a spirit, that type of mentality. And when you have that type of mentality, you tend to take care of things better. Like, I remember my dad telling me a story when he was visiting Iowa, when he was in high school, and his host family, the father needed to reach something on the shelf and he couldn't reach it, so he stacked books and stepped on the books to reach it. And my dad was horrified, right? Because in Japan, books have spirit, so you can't just step on them and use it as a step stool. So it's just a very different kind of thinking about objects in your relationship with nature and just respecting everything. And like sometimes my friends laugh at me because when I throw away, an orange peel. Like in Japan, there's a very specific way of peeling things,
Really?
parting things. And if you don't do it that way, we cringe, right? Because it's like we're disrespecting the orange peel. And so, it is a very different type of thinking. But a concrete example is in Japan, bath water, because we bathe before we get into the bathtub, is relatively clean. It doesn't have soap. So it can be reused, and it often goes into the laundry machine. And it's used again before it goes out. So, these are little things, but if you do it across all households, it becomes a very significant difference, right?
Yeah, that's actually a really good example. But you mentioned Japan, but how much of it is driven by the culture, and how long does it take to develop that culture? And is it possible in any other country?
I mean, I think we're seeing these movements. So there's a really interesting institute called the Institute of Biomimicry. And, it's basically about learning from nature. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel in so many cases, but oftentimes, like the first impulse, especially in the West, is to come up with a new, cool, fancy technology, like do R&D and come up with
Yeah.
something really complicated. When you can actually look at nature and say, well, there's a really simple solution, like the bees are doing this, or the trees protect their bark by secreting this fluid. It's like, how can we imitate that? How can we learn from these best practices? So it's about opening your eyes and not just looking at the future, but looking at history and learning from our ancestors and also from other cultures, right? I think the US tends to be so just focused on their own innovations and solutions and again the future, that they tend to forget that there are so many like free resources that are available that we can learn so much from.
If all this is implemented, how do you see the world that's completely adopted this philosophy of holistic approach, completely holistic, the way you think it should be? What's different in the US in that scenario?
I mean, I think because social sustainability, environmental sustainability, economic sustainability are all intertwined. If we can really start to use this approach and look at all the issues holistically, then we can really start to solve all these different issues simultaneously, right? So, for example, if we can reduce environmental pollution, then the air quality goes up, right? And then people have less asthma, their productivity goes up, they can earn more money, they can buy better nutritious foods, they can have access to good, better quality healthcare, better quality education. It's just like all these things are connected. So if you can solve these issues together, so even if you're in charge of a nonprofit that saves or that focuses on beach cleaning, if you understand like why plastic pollution is so bad, then maybe you'll start collaborating with an advocacy group that tries to prevent more fossil fuel plants to be built, right? Because there's like this cradle to grave, like plastic is toxic from the beginning because it's actually made from fossil fuel, which I don't know if many people understand that. But if you understand and connect these dots, then we can really start to say, okay, well, I'm going to work on this. You should do this. Let's do this together.
So there obviously are quite a few non-profits that try to tackle the problem. Do you think something is wrong with their approach? Because I'm not sure how far along they are in whether they gain traction at all or not.
I don't think it's that these nonprofits, are doing anything wrong. It's, well, oftentimes they don't have the resources that businesses do, or that these, super PACs or interest groups have. So one thing again is if we can create this more holistic collaborative approach, and maybe they can learn from businesses about how to create more revenues so that they can scale their impact. And there now we have more hybrid versions that are kind of like B Corps that have this ingrained in their mission statement, and they are locked in to make sure that they are not just profit maximizing, that they're actually making positive social and environmental impact. And so this kind of ties into stakeholder capitalism and making sure that companies are held accountable for not just, again, thinking about their shareholders and their board members, but the community and their supply chain and their customers.
I think it's fair to say that, yeah, I hear the community and sustainability way more now than I heard maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It's definitely a trend going that direction. But my concern now, if we use this wrong approach all along, right? So yeah, we talk about sustainability, but if we not look at this holistically, as you said, but analytically, or I'm not sure if I got the right word, can we end up in the wrong place?
I mean, I think more and more like institutional investors. So, the business roundtable really is now emphasizing stakeholder capitalism. And that means that they're understanding this, that the way businesses should be run and on a more holistic level, right? Because if you only think about shareholders, that's a narrow type of thinking. But if you're like, wait a minute, I think we should be responsible for more and our impact on other stakeholders too. So that is holistic. And so I think people are starting to wake up to this, because there is no future if it's not sustainable, because we are running against time. Whether we believe that climate change comes from human activity or not, the weather is actually changing, and there are already scarcity issues all around the world, whether it's water or people not being able to live on the coast anymore because the sea level is rising. Like, these things are happening, right? Regardless of what the reason is. So we need to really come together and think about this on a cross-cultural and holistic level, because we can't solve this as just one country or one nonprofit or one individual.
So then we need all the countries to start thinking about it together. How long do you think it would take for even one country to adopt these policies, and then for the entire world to move that direction?
I mean, I think a lot of countries are already doing this. And so, I wrote in my article about weird societies. So that's not an acronym that I invented, but it stands for Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And the US is an extreme outlier even within those countries, which is basically Western Europe. And so most of the world is not weird, right? And most of the non-Western cultures are holistic and more collectivistic, but they have other issues. So, having a holistic approach is necessary but not sufficient to solve sustainability issues. I think a really good example of countries that are employing this type of approach is Scandinavian countries. So, Norway, for example, has this really different kind of prison system where they really focus on making sure that their inmates can easily transition back into society. In the US, as you know, that's not really the goal of the prisons. They make the inmates feel like inhuman or subhuman. They don't get to do anything like the Norwegian inmates do, which is create music. They have even like a music studio inside the prison. They can play games like chess or basketball with the prison staff. There's a kitchen where they can cook their own meal. So, and then they can make crafts and sell it to the public. So it's just a really different way of thinking about why are we what is the goal? It's not just to punish them. It's to make sure that they're productive members of society.
I'm listening to you and I'm thinking that somebody who quite a few people would disagree even on this example would be like, okay, and what I see quite often, the argument would be, look, this person committed the crime, and now we're paying taxes to sustain the music creation or video, and you know what I mean. Like I almost can already see these comments in the comment section, like
Using analytic thinking, because that's very short-term thinking. Because it's even more expensive if they go out and they commit a crime again, and we have to put them back in prison, right? And think
that's
about
true.
the impact that will have on their families. Are their kids going to grow up as productive members of society, or are they going to join a gang, right?
I agree. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Mirei, what did I miss? Like, what are the some big ideas that we should have discussed but we didn't? Because I feel like there's so much to discuss here, and I almost can't wrap my head around like how this can be implemented. I definitely see the benefits, but there are certainly things that I missed in the.
Well, so the other thing that we didn't really talk about is human interactions. So if you use a more analytic way of thinking, um, the one bias that you're very prone to is the fundamental attribution error, which I will explain. So, for example, if someone murders someone, if you're using, if you're prone to the fundamental attribution error, you automatically think this person is an evil person. This person is, you know, this is just like how they were born, and they could have controlled their behavior, but they didn't. And so you place a lot of emphasis on this person, right? And their ability and their innate traits versus thinking, well, maybe, like he was desperate for money, and this guy was carrying a briefcase that looked expensive because, he has a sick mom and he can't buy her medicine if he doesn't have money. So just thinking about contextual factors is not really done. So if you are not prone to this, then you tend to consider, well, maybe there are other things that influence this person's behavior. So there's a really interesting and simple research study that illustrates this really well, and the cross-cultural differences. So people who are holistic thinkers are less likely to be biased in this way, or not to the same degree. So they showed Japanese and American research subjects a fish tank, and they just said, look at this fish tank. And then later they asked, what do you remember? And so the American subjects remember the fish and maybe how many fish there were and whether they were blue or green. The Japanese subjects remembered, like the little toys in the background, and there was like a little castle, and there was moss and seaweed. And so they looked at the whole tank, not just focusing on the fish. So that's a pretty big difference in how you view the world.
I want to go back to that example that you brought up, like some that the actions we take, a lot of times it's not just our decision but also the environment, right? I agree with you, but does it mean that we need to redo the laws against people committing crimes because suddenly you have an opportunity to blame something else that.
I just listened to a podcast, and I don't remember exactly, the specifics, but the idea is that these laws were created back in the day when we barely had any research on brain science and the kinds of chemical imbalances that cause people to behave in certain ways, like engage in violent behavior, that we know now are not really controllable by the individual. So say, for example, you didn't get, you had too much lead. So there is actually a really interesting and simple case in the US or maybe not so simple, but a really good illustration of this, where all of a sudden, for a certain period of time, there was a lot of violent crime that happened in the US. And so a lot of people got arrested, mostly men. And then later it turned out, I'm summarizing this very much, but they figured out that it was because there was lead in the gasoline. And so once they stopped using lead in gasoline, and they could see that this was true because each state of had different timings of when they stopped using lead, right? And then they started seeing a drop in violent crime. So can you blame the individual 100% for committing these crimes? I think the answer is no. But we need to update and incorporate this knowledge we have now about, genetic predispositions to certain types of behaviors, mental illnesses, brain science, when we think about how irresponsible someone is for their behavior.
In order for people to start thinking this way, it's probably going to take generations, maybe even.
Yeah.
And does the Earth have this much time? Like, are we going to be too late before we get to the point where, hey, this is where we should have been a few hundred years ago? What do you think?
I mean, I think there are certain things like this, like if someone commits a violent crime, it's really hard for people to say, okay, like even if you understand it was something that was wrong with their brain, it's hard to say, okay, I forgive you. So I think that is more difficult because it's very personal and intimate, and it just pulls on our moral heartstrings. But if it's about, like the fossil fuel industry and what they're doing, and certain types of propaganda that the plastics industry spread, for example, they do you remember that advertising campaign with this Native American Indian crying because there's like pollution, and he's saying, like some people care about the world and others don't? So it was a very moving advertisement, and it turns out that the people who created this is the plastics industry, because they wanted to put the onus on consumers. They're like, oh my God, now there's so much litter everywhere. And they knew it was going to come back to them. So they made that campaign, Make America Beautiful, to get in front of that issue and make consumers feel like it's their responsibility. Right? So again, it's like, how do we think about these issues? If we understand more, if we understand how everything is connected, then we can really start to move people.
So my thing is, until people individually start moving that direction, until people start realizing it, it's almost like it's hard to achieve, because corporations are corporations. They don't think years ahead. They think quarter by quarter, right? Most of the time, and only now I see them start talking about the sustainability. But as you said, it's almost like hypocritical ad that they created, like almost blaming it on consumers, that what they doing, right?
Well,
So,
I think you can't just paint the whole corporate America with one broad stroke, because fossil fuel is notoriously, very, I don't want to say evil, but they care more about profits and making sure that their industry doesn't die, versus other industries where, like, okay, we need to pivot, we need to start thinking about consumers. Because if institutional investors and consumers care, then they need to start caring, because it is true that like money moves everything. So if consumers stop buying your product, then you're in trouble. And if investors stop investing in your company, you're in trouble.
I think this discussion is a perfect example what issue people gonna be facing as this going to be rolling out, right? Because You've been educating me about holistic view, yet every time there is example, I try to pinpoint one thing, and you going back like, well, actually, let's look at this like from the broader perspective. And I kind of realized, and I thought like, well, this is funny. Like she keeps saying it, and I continue doing the same thing. I get used to it. And I'm not even from this culture, you know. It's funny. It's just funny to me. Anyway, yeah.
I mean, part of it is what we see and what's available in front of us is what we think is the whole truth. Just that's just like the way we are. But if we can really start, even just a little bit, start thinking, well, wait a minute, maybe I'm missing something, because almost always we're missing something or various things. And so part of it is stop. Let's try to stop making these like knee-jerk responses. And that's why I mentioned how we engage with each other is, if you automatically assume that the other person is wrong because they're conservative or they don't agree with your opinion, then you're at an impasse. But if you give them a chance to explain and look at, well, maybe this person has a point, right? Like, I wonder why this person thinks this way. So a part of it is perspective taking and stepping outside of your own view and your comfort zone to try to understand it from a different perspective.
What are some other important thing that I didn't touch on?
First of all, I think there's always this assumption that, so even when you hear like psychologists from top university talk about their research, they say, this is just the way we're wired, like this is just how humans are, when it's not actually universal, right? So this kind of goes back to the weird idea. But if you think about most of the published research comes from a tiny portion of universities in the world, mostly Western and mostly American. And who do they do their research on? Their undergraduate students. Is that representative of the world?
So wait, so everything we know about behavior of people primarily, it's based off the American undergrads.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yes. That if you think about it that way, it's a little scary.
Yeah.
And the only people who explicitly say this is not universal are cross-cultural researchers who specifically, explicitly, proactively study, okay, this is how Russians are, this is how Chinese are versus Americans. And they say that's why like this is not universal. But most other research that is not cross-cultural is based on American undergrads.
It almost gives me a hope that we're not as irrational. Maybe that's the word. Maybe it's just these young American undergraduates who are being that irrational, but in reality, are very rational creatures, which I doubt, by the way.
That you say that you think they are irrational because they think they're rational, right? That again goes back to the analytic thinking, is that they think they're being rational, and so the way they answer questions is very rational, right? They're like, A plus B equals C, therefore C is X, Y, and Z. And so if you actually look at how Asians do on like logic questions, they actually sometimes are worse than American students because they can't not think about context. They're like, well, maybe, even though it says don't think about the context, just think about what's on the paper. They're like, well, but maybe this person was feeling this way that day, or this person was doing this. So they start to think about like contextual factors that are not there when they're trying to answer logic questions. So it's again like not universal how we respond to certain situations. But there are commonalities between people too. And the interesting thing is that there are systematic, the biases that like fundamental attribution error is a systematic bias. So that's why we can use that type of knowledge that we have about biases to kind of correct people's behavior, because we know that like this type of people in this type of situation tend to make this error. So then you can design something to make sure that that doesn't happen, or sometimes use that to your advantage and create a policy or um, some kind of initiative that way. So, for example, with blood donors or organ donors, we know that people are actually pretty lazy. And so
With check
they
marks?
go with the default option. Yes, right? So then you make the default option what you want people to choose. So if you want more people to donate their organs, you make that the default. Of course, there are certain ethical questions around certain types of, um, you know, policies, but we can use our knowledge of behavioral science in this way so that we can create nudges.
So basically, we know the way to make people do what we want them to do. The question is, how do we? I mean, who's gonna do it? Like, when does this? I don't know. Government makes this a priority. Is this fair enough?
I mean, I think certain organizations are already using behavioral science
Mm-hmm.
to shape the way they create their programs and policies. Um, but I think what's more important than just nudges, like nudges are important too, but nudges are specific to the context. And once that person goes out of the context, it's not there anymore. Like the effect goes away. So I think what's also important to do is to change the way people think. So, if you use the word we versus I, if you ask people to think about us versus me, then people really start to behave in a collective way, right? Or if you have people think about similarities with somebody else versus differences, then even if it's an arbitrary similarity, like you're both wearing glasses or you both have the same last name, it can be something that brings people together and bridges the gap for people to start thinking about the other person as more human and someone they can relate to.
At what point, not just one country will understand the importance of the sustainability, but all the countries, because one country alone doesn't really uh, help. I mean, it's great if everyone in the United States start doing it, but what about other 190 something countries?
I mean, again, well, first of all, the US is a huge player, right, in the world. It has a lot of power, economic and policy and otherwise. So, if we want the US to become this leader and lead the way to solve like the climate issue and other sustainability issues and humanitarian issues, then let's first work on the US. But because some of the other countries that are not Western have other issues like economic issues and poverty issues and infrastructure issues that we need to solve before we can even say like to the population like you need to be focusing on sustainability. I mean, it's the same thing in the US. You can't possibly expect someone who doesn't know where their next meal is coming from to focus on climate change, right? That's just not fair. But that's precisely why we need to solve these inequality issues, um, and racism issues and human justice issues so that we can all come together and focus our resources on solving what we need to solve.
I think I know the first step. I know that you're writing the book right now. So when the book is written, I think the first step for you to send this book to decision makers and see for them to see it. Is this a plan?
That is my North Star. Is the White House will read my book, then I mean, well, Obama used to have a behavioral insights team. The Trump administration unfortunately got rid of that team, but I'm hoping that the Biden administration will have a similar team who understands that sustainability is a human problem, right? If it weren't for humans, we wouldn't have a sustainability issue. That means we have to understand human behavior and we have to shape human behavior. We have to understand how people think and how that results in how they behave. So that's why I think this has to be a critical part of the solution. We can't just rely on technology and innovation and policies.
Well, it's a very important subject, and I'm glad we're talking about it, and I'm also glad you writing about it. So, Dr. Takashima Claremon, thank you very much for the interview, and looking forward to the book, and wishing you best of luck with your studies.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our time.